Welcome to I Am One, where I am one with the Creator and one with myself. We have entered the month of October. Today is October the 2nd, 2023. And what I have learned today is that this month, each month has some type of awareness that they remind us of to be on the lookout for or to be have heightened senses about. And so we know that October is National Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and we should be aware, ladies, we should be aware of our health and our breast health. But what I learned today that it is also HooDoo Heritage Month. I had never heard of this until I started getting more information and learning about and starting a practice of my own in hoodoo or conjure or root work. And so with that being said, of course you know, and maybe you don't, but I started doing tarot, starting to learn tarot, and I have several decks on hand, and I actually have a HooDoo deck that I started looking at a little bit but haven't really delved into. But I thought since this is the month of HooDoo Heritage, that I won't go through all of the cards, but what I will do is I will randomly pick a card. I'm just going to do Monday through Friday for the month of October. And that will get us through all 21 of the major arcana, or in this deck, they're called the elders. So tonight, what I thought I would do was just read and introduce you to what hoodoo is all about. And I'm actually reading from the book that came with the HooDoo deck, and it's called the HooDoo Tarot by Tiana Lee McQuiller. She wrote the book, she created the cards, and they're pretty cool. But what she does in her book, she gives an introduction to what hoodoo is, and I want to read that because I think it will help you understand what hoodoo is, what hoodoo isn't, and the background for these cards. So here's the introduction to the HooDoo Tarot by Tiana Lee McQuiller. It says, Introduction, a culture, an inheritance, and a rebellion. What is hoodoo? By the time you read this, it will have been almost 20 years since Root Work, the Folk Magic of Black America, was published. At the time, there were very few contemporary books written on the subject of hoodoo, but today, there are literally dozens of them. The resurgence of mainstream interest in witchcraft, the occult, and African or indigenous spirituality is without a doubt responsible for the proliferation of literature, workshops, festivals, conferences, and social media groups focused on root working. As a result, there have been a shocking number of people claiming to be practitioners, authorities, and or teachers of this centuries-old tradition. It is for this reason that I decided it was time for me to address the topic again, not to berate anyone else, but to clarify a few things, get more in depth, and correct a huge mistake I made in my first book. This era was the description of hoodoo as folk magic, in an attempt to assimilate the topic to academic language and standards. But hoodoo wasn't folk magic when it started being described as such by social scientists, nor is it folk magic now. Hoodoo is a culture, an inheritance with a distinct lineage in North America. It is the product of people who face terrorism and unimaginable suffering on a daily basis, yet refuse to relinquish all of their power and identity. Hoodoo, in addition to being a body of botanical and esoteric knowledge, is also a rebellion against absolute mental and spiritual domination by Europeans. That is the essence, the reality of what hoodoo is, but there are many ways one may define its composition. The oft-repeated and most widely accepted narrative characterizes hoodoo as a primarily African retention with Native American and European influences. However, that is only a theory, and a difficult one to prove at that. The reasons for this are several, as outlined below. 1. We know little to nothing about the underground religious spiritual lives of any racial or ethnic groups in colonial America. Contrary to popular belief, the colonists were not the rigid religious zealots people think they were. In fact, only approximately 15% of the population before 1760 were members of any church, which is why officials constantly complained about the unabashed sinners, vice, and all-around loose living in the colonies. Therefore, the only information that does exist about the religious life of the colony is based on the 15% of people who were willing or able to attend church. There is even less information available about the spiritual lives of Africans or Aboriginal Americans, save for a plethora of generic accusations of heathenry. 2. Some of the elements of root work that are classified as African retentions, such as bone divination, quartered ideographic religious symbols, medicine bundles, etc., are ubiquitous to many indigenous American cultures as well. 3. Like Black Americans, hoodoo is not a monolith. The tradition takes on variations depending on one's family history and location. Commonly, hoodoo knowledge is inherited, so the information passed down regarding methodology and philosophy may be as diverse and complex as the family from which that knowledge originates. 4. Colonial America was far less segregated and had more interracial/interethnic couples than many contemporary American cities did until very recently. Not only were interracial/interethnic marriages normal, but socializing between people of all nationalities was common until almost a century after the establishment of Jamestown. Obviously, with the sharing of bloodlines and dinner tables, there will also be a considerable amount of sharing of information. 5. Hoodoo has never been static. While discussions of mainstream religions and neo-pagan spirituality address the shifts and changes that occur within those communities and the external social political environment that also affects them, root work somehow remains strangely unchanging in the popular imagination. 6. All systems and philosophies are affected by the shifting demographics of a nation's population and, consequently, the greater cultural conversation. For example, the dominant religion in the 17th century was Puritanism. In the 18th century, it was deism or evangelicalism. And in the 19th century, it was transcendentalism or Unitarianism or revivalism. All of these changes are the result of new ideas that arrived in North America with new immigrants or the well-traveled intelligentsia among the elites. For example, if there were more Pamunkey, Irish, and Guinean people living, working, and loving in an area between 1619 to 1800, then a root worker's approach may reflect the beliefs, attitudes, and methods of one or all of these populations, depending on their own personal history and interactions with these groups. That being said, this work does not attempt to tell the truth about what hoodoo is or is not. My objectives are to 1. Pay homage to practitioners known and unknown who saw the value in their ancestral practices and had the courage to keep the tradition alive despite constant persecution and denigration for doing so. 2. Consider some of the ways in which North America's interethnic spiritual and intellectual heritage may have informed root workers of various class or education levels. 3. Show how the history of Black North Americans makes root work specific to their experience alone and is therefore unfairly compared to foreign systems that may appear to be synonymous, such as Vodou. Vodou, also spelled voodoo, is a religion whose practitioners in the Western Hemisphere, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Brazil, Louisiana, etc., were often Catholic. While many elements are familiar to us as inhabitants of the Americas, every country has their own history and unique demographical composition that inform their systems and practices. Root workers are united, however, by the Anglo-American Protestant traditions and those of the indigenous nations of North America. 4. Exhibit the sacred sites, flora, fauna, minerals, and other natural wonders of the southeastern region of North America. 5. Increase awareness of the fact that there is no separating Black history from Indigenous history, because the two are often intertwined by bloodline and or common experiences, chattel slavery, forced relocations, land theft, etc. This is not to mention the long history of darker and broader featured Aboriginal populations being purposely reclassified as mulatto, colored, or Negro, and detribalized to facilitate land theft, Christian conversion, and overall cultural genocide. In fact, it is still commonplace to attribute elements of Black American culture to Africans or African retentions, even when based solely on a theory or where there is proof to the contrary. For instance, soul food ingredients, dishes, and preparation methods predate chattel slavery by thousands of years. For example, grits, sweet potatoes, cornbread, hush puppies, poke salad, Johnny cakes, climbing beans or green beans, barbecued meats, and fried foods were all part of the daily diet of Eastern American woodland populations. That is just one example of the erasure of Black America's indigenous North American heritage and lineage, but there are several others. However, addressing any more would require more in-depth explanations, which would threaten to take me away from the scope of this book. The origin of hoodoo. No one knows exactly when what we know today as hoodoo began, but it probably started not too long after indigenous Americans, Africans, and Europeans came into daily contact with one another during the colonial era. All three groups had significant indentured servant and enslaved populations who worked, socialized, and intermarried with one another on a regular basis. Most Europeans during the colonial era were overwhelmingly Protestant and hailed from England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and the Netherlands. The majority of the approximately 388,000 African people who were shipped to North America, including Canada, between the 17th and 19th centuries came from a variety of ethnic groups. They were Malagasy, Congo, Igbo, Maghrebis or Moors, Akan, Mande, Hausa, and Fube, among many others. There were hundreds of indigenous tribes in the southeast alone prior to colonization, the smaller of whom later joined or were absorbed into larger confederacies, such as the Creek or the Cherokee. Unbeknown to many, there were also other nationalities and ethnic groups who were enslaved, indentured, or voluntarily migrated to North America during the colonial era as well. There were dark-skinned coolies from India and China, Pacific Islanders, the Roma people, aka Gypsies, many of whom were reclassified and denationalized in official documents by using descriptors such as white, mulatto, or Negro. These groups are also the ancestors of many Black Americans who may have incorporated their knowledge into hoodoo, but today have no clue that they have this ancestry. All of the aforementioned peoples from around the world had their own cosmologies, philosophies, folklore, and remedies. Thus, some might say that hoodoo is North America's only totally unrestricted repository of esoteric knowledge. The forms of divination traditionally used in hoodoo. There are several forms of divination used in hoodoo. Claromancy involves the casting of small objects such as shells, bones, stalks, coins, nuts, stones, dice, sticks, etc. The casting of bones specifically may be referred to as scapulomancy or osteomancy. Root workers commonly use cat, opossum, or chicken bones as the preferred medium for casting lots. This practice became known as throwing the bones. This divination method is ubiquitous around the world. Several African ethnic groups who voluntarily migrated to or were enslaved in North America, such as the Congo and the Igbo, were scapulomancers, osteomancers, or claromancers. Indigenous American tribes such as the Labrador and the Algonquin also practice these different forms of divination. Throwing the bones most likely remained a respectable and common practice in hoodoo due to its justification in the Bible. The casting of lots was totally acceptable among the early prophets and the disciples of Jesus. Cartomancy is divination by means of interpreting cards. Traditionally, playing cards were the only cards used by root workers because that was what was available to them. However, for root workers, the manner in which the cards were prepared to be read and meanings attributed to the cards were different from mainstream cartomancers. As hoodoo relies on the ancestors and the Holy Spirit, individual root workers would have their own method of conjuring both to ensure that all negative energy stayed as far away from the querent and themselves as possible. Natural or judicial astrology is the study of the positions and motions of celestial bodies in the belief that they have an influence over nature and human affairs. Root workers pay serious attention to lunar phases, solar positions, and sometimes stars before doing their work. The initiation of certain workings during the wrong time of day or evening could seriously diminish the effectiveness of a working. They believe there is a proper time and place to do everything. In the early 20th century, some root workers began to incorporate the basic elements of tropical astrology and to consult charts, but judicial astrology remained ubiquitous for most. The church taught that the belief in the influence of heavenly bodies upon health, fortune, temperament, or actions was unchristian, but many root workers did not care. Primarily, this was because it was tradition. Second, it worked for them. And most important, powerful biblical personalities and prophets such as Joseph, Daniel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah adhered to prophecies predicted via natural astrology. Augury is the deciphering of phenomena or omens that are believed to foretell the future, often signifying the advent of change. This often involved the observation of animal behavior. Hoodoo developed outdoors, and many of its practitioners were extremely in tune with nature as landowners and agricultural workers. Many Southerners were still growing their own food until well into the mid-20th century, making people expert horticulturalists, botanists, and zoologists out of necessity. It was crucial to know when the appropriate times were to plant, till, and reap what one had sown. It was also equally important to know the behavior of the wildlife in one's area to avoid harm to one's person, livestock, or crops. As a result of proximity to the land and cultural associations with certain animals and their behavior, benefic or malefic, people paid careful attention to any unusual occurrences as they could be predictions of change. Whether the augur interpreted certain phenomena as positive or negative, querents took note and did workings to try to either repel or increase the effect of whatever was coming their way. Oneiromancy is a form of divination based upon dreams. Root workers paid close attention to symbolism. In fact, it was common practice for hoodoo practitioners to make predictions for themselves and others based on their dreams. As with the augur, the oneiromancer would make suggestions to secure forthcoming blessings or offer remedies to prevent or minimize misfortune if the dream was deemed negative. And so that is a brief description of her take on what hoodoo is. And again, each weekday, a card from the major arcana, or the elders as she calls them, will randomly be picked and will be explained for that day. So I hope you join me during this month of Hoodoo Heritage. And with that, peace and blessings to you all.